Good afternoon from India. My name is Adishri and I'm a research associate at the Center for Urban Planning and Governance at TERI. A warm welcome to everyone to the 2021 edition of the Energy and Resources Institute or TERI's annual flagship event, the World Sustainable Development Summit, which is being held virtually this year under the broad theme of redefining our common future, safe and secure environment for all. And it's occurring from the 10th to 12th February 2021. This edition of WSDS marks 20 years of the platform, and it is a matter of great pride for TERI that all of you, speakers and delegates alike, have been able to join us for this important milestone edition. Your support is instrumental in the success of the platform and our efforts. With this, I am delighted to welcome all of you to this thematic track on day one of WSDS titled Private Sector's Role in Achieving Climate Resilience, Leading Examples from Coastal Cities, in partnership with the European Union. This session aims to provide a platform for private sector entities leading climate action efforts in coastal cities to showcase their ongoing initiatives and achievements and highlight the challenges they face. In addition, we will also discuss the potential for private and public sector collaborations and partnerships to achieve urban climate change resilience. To kickstart the session, I would like to request Mr. Edwin Kukuk, delegation of the European Union in India, to deliver the introductory remarks. He is responsible for cooperation between EU and India in the areas of energy and climate action, including the implementation of the EU-India Clean Energy and Climate Partnership. So, sir, Mr. Edwin, we welcome you. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Adishri, and good morning to those in Europe, and good afternoon to those in India. So first of all, I would like to say that as European Union, we are very happy that we are partnering with the World Sustainable Development Summit. We will be discussing many issues that are very relevant for our EU-India cooperation. And we will have speakers in several sessions from both the European Commission and from EU member states. And I'm also very proud to announce that our Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Frans Timmermans, will speak on Friday in the valedictory session. Indeed, one of my main roles here in India is the implementation of the EU-India Clean Energy and Climate Partnership. And we are working together with India on energy efficiency, renewable energy, grid integration of this renewable energy, but also on sustainable finance and on climate change. And climate change is not only about mitigation on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but more and more, we realize that climate change is happening and we need to become more resilient. So in our cooperation, we also focus very much on adaptation to climate change. So that's why we are very happy with this session today, which hopefully will be a very concrete session, focusing on how to increase resilience against climate change in coastal cities. And I think the setting is really useful. It starts with three more general presentations. One on the event that we also co-organized with Mumbai First, and I'm very happy to see Mr. Nayar here, and also actually Mr. Anirban Ghosh, who was in that same conference that took place last year in February on coastal cities, and it was in the city of Mumbai, a very good place to organize such an event. Then we will also have a presentation on Adaptation Future, which is another very important event that will take place later this year, and several webinars have already taken place, and we will learn about the main findings. And then there will be a more general presentation on the Climate Adaptation Summit that took place in the end of January. Again, setting out the general context and also focusing on coastal cities. I think those three presentations will give a very good background for the panel discussion that will actually then focus on concrete solutions, on the barriers, on policy needs, and also on financing. And I hope that this panel discussion will result in concrete recommendations. So I'm very much looking forward to the session, and I wish all of you a very fruitful and inspiring event. Thank you very much. Over to you, Adishe.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kukuk, for highlighting the importance of partnerships for knowledge sharing and developing innovative solutions, as well as giving us an indication what lies ahead in the session today. I would now like to request Mr. Narinder Nayar, Chairman at Mumbai First, to tell us more about the key learnings from the Climate Change Action for Tropical Coastal Cities Conference. Along with his role as Chairman, he is the founder and Chief Executive of Concast India. He has also been actively involved with the Mumbai Transformation Program, spearheaded by the Honorable Chief Minister of Maharashtra. Can I request Chanmajay to please share his presentation, and Mr. Nayar, I welcome you to please present now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Edwin. Nice to see you again. May I say what a great pleasure and indeed an honor it is to be invited to speak at the summit on a subject so very important for our city, for our country, and indeed for the whole world. A lot of people have asked me about the organization that I represent, and let me begin by giving a brief introduction of Mumbai First, which is celebrating a very important milestone, the Silver Jubilee. Mumbai First, an initiative of the corporate world, was set up with a vision to make the city a better place to live, work, and invest in. Following a study done with McKinsey to show how Mumbai could be transformed into a world-class city, a very close public-private partnership was established with the state government and formed the basis of a Vision Mumbai document prepared by the government of Maharashtra, and several infrastructure projects that are now being implemented are a part of this report. Ladies and gentlemen, when we started our journey, we had no illusion that our task was going to be easy. But we now know what the challenges and opportunities are. There are indeed many challenges that the city faces, but in our view, area that requires immediate and urgent attention is to deal with the consequences of climate change. Since the Stern Committee review in 2006, climate change has rapidly become a single largest threat to mankind in a very short period of time. Having overtaken all predicted scenarios, the term climate emergency is more appropriate to describe the time we live in. In the wake of unprecedented climate disasters, climate change has rapidly taken a root in the global consciousness, and the desire to act is stronger than ever before across the government and citizens. The floods of 2005 in Mumbai should have been a wake-up call. Now, due to extreme heat days and severe rainfalls, floods are more likely than ever to be part of Mumbai coast. The Mumbai monsoon patterns have changed. There are more extreme rainfall days now than 10 years ago. Seawater levels have been rising, and the risk of coastal floods and cyclones are real. Nearly 40% of Mumbai could be underwater by 2050 if seawater continues to rise. The recent science has shown that the challenges are more severe than we imagined. Mitigation of the impact of climate change requires a serious and urgent efforts at all levels. We in Mumbai are particularly concerned about Mumbai and the Mumbai metropolitan region, which constitutes a quarter of Maharashtra's population and makes significant contribution in the economic development, 30% of Maharashtra GDP and 6% of national GDP. We firmly believe without policies and strategies that would mitigate the damages from the natural disasters, we risk nearly $1 billion in the economic damages by 2050. We strongly felt that something needs to be done. And to start with, we organized a two-day international conference, referred to by Edwin a little while ago, Climate Crisis Action for Tropical Coastal Cities in Mumbai, where national and international experts shared their experiences and helped evolve a suitable agenda for our city to meet the challenges of climate change. At the conference, we were delighted to witness Mumbai Mayor and the Municipal Commissioner signing an agreement to be a part of Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, thus committing Mumbai to escalate ambitious and measurable initiatives that will lead to low emissions and climate resilience in future. Several recommendations emerged from the conference deliberations, which are shown on the slide. However, I would emphasize that areas that require great attention are infrastructure management, resource management, and knowledge management. Mumbai First also strongly recommended setting up a multidisciplinary working group under the chairmanship of the Principal Secretary for Environment and Climate Change for the Government of Maharashtra to strategize and manage climate mitigation action plan for the Mumbai metropolitan region. I would also like to take this opportunity to compliment Government of Maharashtra for the unique initiative Maji Vasundhara, which means Maji Vasundhara is a Marathi word which means my earth, to make citizens aware of the impact of climate change and environmental issues. Mumbai First is fully committed to support this unique initiative. Finally, one must agree with the informed view that climate change is indeed a disaster in the making for the future of the world and for all who exist in it. It is therefore imperative that we deal with the situation now on a matter of urgency and before it is too late. I once again thank the organizers for giving us an opportunity to share some of our work at this very important summit. Thank you.
Can we have me? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for providing. Thank you so much, Mr. Nayar, for joining us and for providing the learnings from the conference and highlighting what proactive steps can be taken to address climate risk, especially in coastal cities. The learnings from the conference especially have been very useful for us, and we take the learnings forward. Now I would like to invite my colleague, Mr. Saurabh Bhardwaj, Fellow at the Earth Science and Climate Change Division of TERI, for elaborating on resilience building through climate science and policy. He is an experienced climate change professional with transversal expertise in addressing hazards as well as in policy interface projects. May I request Saurabh to please share their presentation and request you to begin.
Thank you so much, Adishri, and also thank you, the organizers, for inviting me for this very relevant topic of discussion. A big good morning, good evening, as well as good afternoon to everybody who is watching me right now and listening to me. Before speaking on to the few takeaways from the 6th Adaptation Futures webinar series, I would like to present you with some context of what basically we are dealing with right now. Uh, we all know that the climate hazards are increasing right now, right? And specifically in over India, local or regional extremes are rising. Sea level along the Indian coast, and since we are talking about the coastal part of it, the sea level rise on the eastern coast is projected at around rising at the rate of 1.3 millimeter a year. The number of cyclones and severe cyclones in Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal has risen by nearly 11% in last decade, and with an alarming 32% increase in the last 5 years itself. So the projections also project kind of more heat waves and heat stresses. And Indian cities have been facing this stress and the impacts as we speak. Last 20 years have had economic losses in billions of dollars, uh, particularly to the climate-related disasters. And many cities, and probably around 56% of smart cities, are in districts with flood events even higher than the national mean. And with the urban population increasing, as we speak, all these climate impacts are seriously undermining the development goals of cities. So building climate resilience is one of the only options that we have to offer, which offers us a holistic mechanism to address climate variability and change without compromising on the present developmental challenges. Globally, many cities across the world are engaging in planning for climate resilience and transforming their systems to address climate variability and change without compromising on the present development challenges. TEHIAS has also helped few cities in India via their different projects, specifically coastal city projects for Vishakhapatnam and Panaji, in which the building resilience was basically done by adding climate variability and change considerations in planning and development framework to ensure long-term sustainability. Particularly to achieve the global adaptation goal, which is put forth in Paris Agreement as Article 7.1, it is important to engage all state, non-state, subnational, non-state actors to align the political will with an adaptation needs and build long-term resilience. 2020 have been a year of compounding risks, and it becomes important for us to recognize the policies, plans, and vision at national level to align them with the economic, social, environmental, and health risk arising from these climate events. We need to have such kind of a dialogues between different actors, and specifically the private sector, to arrive at such sustainable solutions. For the first time in India, adaptation futures, it is happening for the first time in Asia, and India would be hosting it. And since we couldn't host it last year, several pre-conference webinars were organized, and some key takeaways on the NSAs, non-state actions, were that they are very crucial in identifying local and regional contexts, and they can also aid in strengthening participation of local communities. And specific to private sector, I would say stronger public, private, and people partnership is very important to help find scalable, resilient solutions on the shared vision. And enhancing climate resilience, and it will also help in enhancing climate resilience by creating some business opportunities. The private sector is very important and can bring in resources and expertise to basically kickstart this and implement this. And risk management and building urban resilience solution is a teamwork. And this teamwork has a big portion of private sectors as a big part of it as well. The virtual engagements under Adaptation Futures, they have provided a platform to facilitate a dialogue towards action-oriented solutions from a diverse range of stakeholders, including private sector. And these webinars have witnessed a participation of over 300 people across the globe. The organizers at AF 2020, Adaptation Futures, the 6th edition of Adaptation Futures, they aim to sustain this momentum. And in the run-up of the conference that we plan to organize in October 2021. So I would request all of you to go onto this web link and kindly register it and be a part of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Saurabh.
Thank you, Alisha.
Thank you, Saurabh, for highlighting the importance of incorporating climate variabilities and also all stakeholder inputs in policy decisions. May I now please invite Ms. Sanne van der Mil, Project Leader for the Climate Adaptation Summit at the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, Netherlands, to please present the takeaways from the Climate Adaptation Summit 2021. She has extensive experience in the fields of sustainability, circular economy, climate mitigation and adaptation, and renewable energy. Can I request Janmajay to please share his presentation, and I request ma'am to please begin.
Thank you for the introduction, Adishri, and thank you also for the opportunity to present to you the findings of the Climate Adaptation Summit 2021. Next slide, please. On January 25th and 26th, the Netherlands government was the host of the Climate Adaptation Summit, the first international summit providing a platform for world leaders and a multitude of stakeholders worldwide entirely focused on climate adaptation. The summit builds on the work of the Global Commission on Adaptation, launched in 2018, and on the call to action of the UN Secretary General at the United Nations Action Summit 2019. The summit aims to show that climate adaptation is essential, fundable, doable, and plannable. It therefore had the aim to further accelerate adaptation action and drive systemic change towards a climate resilient future by 2030. Hereby showing the world how to adapt, provide guidance, and scale climate adaptation solutions. By being inclusive, focusing on capacity building, political support, and funding. Next slide, please. The three main goals of the summit were to launch an adaptation action agenda as a roadmap for a decade of transformation towards a climate resilient future by 2030. Making, amongst others, COP26 one of the important milestones of this agenda. The second aim is to create a broader support for climate adaptation among committed citizens worldwide. And the third goal, finally, is to create a climate adaptation community. Next slide, please. Over the course of 24 hours, 27 high-level events and 160 side events were organized worldwide. 32 world leaders took part in the high-level opening session of the summit, and over 50 ministers and international organizations joined the different sessions. The summit had more than 300 speakers and over 18,500 registered participants. Next slide, please. Oh, there are a few clicks here, sorry. And there are a few statements here as well, so if you might want to click on further, that'd be great. Just to state a few statements that were mentioned during the high-level opening session of the summit. The World Bank announced a $5 billion investment in the Great Green Wall, an initiative to combat the increasing desertification in Africa. The African Development Bank pledged to mobilize $25 billion in climate finance between 2020 and 2025, of which at least 50% will support climate adaptation and resilience building. German Chancellor Angela Merkel committed a total of 270 million euros extra budget for climate adaptation in support of the most vulnerable communities. And French President Emmanuel Macron reaffirmed that 2 billion euros, one-third of France's climate finance aid, will be allocated for climate adaptation. Next slide, please. The Adaptation Action Agenda is the most important deliverable of the summit overall. It is an open and inclusive framework for accelerating adaptation action. Building on the work of the Global Commission on Adaptation, the agenda will accommodate increasingly greater action efforts over time. It consists out of 4 parts, starting with an action framework to 2030, in which dozens of different multi-stakeholder initiatives for action to deliver the Adaptation Action Agenda are portrayed. This will be taken forward towards 2030. An SDG, secondly, an SDG Climate Adaptation Action Agenda interface, in which individual multi-stakeholder initiatives that underpin the Adaptation Action Agenda are each mapped against the SDGs, to facilitate monitoring of contributions and to best leverage linkages with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Thirdly, a common monitoring and knowledge exchange platform. Overall progress of efforts to deliver on the Adaptation Action Agenda will be tracked both through the yearly State and Trends report and through a dedicated data and knowledge platform. And finally, build upon key efforts to date. The Adaptation Action Agenda builds on the wide-ranging international collaborations and can carry forward a number of the multi-stakeholder initiatives that were incubated through the efforts of the Global Commission on Adaptation and the outcomes of the UN Climate Action Summit, while also accommodating new and future multi-stakeholder initiatives. Next slide, please. Today, 55% of the world's population lives in urban areas, projected to be 68% by 2050. With this many people living in a relatively small space, managing urban areas has therefore become one of the most important development challenges of the 21st century. Our success or failure in building sustainable cities will be of great importance in the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Agenda. It is therefore not surprising that during the summit, not one but two high-level events dedicated to cities were organized: the Global Mayors Forum and the anchoring event Resilient Cities. Hosted by the City of Miami, together with the World Resources Institute, the Global Center on Adaptation, and many others, the anchoring event Resilient Cities was building on the Mayors Forum led by former UN Secretary General Mr. Ban Ki-moon, with mayors declaring their commitment to building resilient cities. During the summit, the first ever 10-year global program, 1000 Cities Adapt Now, has been established to accelerate and scale climate adaptation in 1000 cities worldwide. Starting with cities mainly in Africa and Southeast Asia, working with multiple partners, this will be scaled up to 100 cities by 2023, 300 cities by 2025, and up to 1,000 cities by 2030 worldwide. The coalition commits to support the most vulnerable urban communities and helps accelerate and scale urban climate adaptation globally by implementing the following 5 principles. Strengthen and prioritize urban adaptation and climate resilience in cities. Build water-resilient cities and nature-based solutions. Advocate for more mandate and funding for cities. Enhance knowledge and capacity on urban adaptation. And finally, coordinate innovations, partners, and investments to maximize synergy. Next slide, please. I would like to thank you all for your attention. Should you have any more questions or if you're curious to learn more about the outcomes of the summit, please feel free to visit our website or social media channels. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for emphasizing the need to accelerate adaptation action to drive systemic change for a climate resilient future and the ways that we can approach it. With this, we conclude with the first half of the session, and I thank all the speakers who have come for their inputs. For those who may have lost, this thematic track focuses on the private sector's role in achieving climate resilience. Building on the previous discussions, we now move towards the panel discussion, which will be followed by a Q&A between the panelists and the delegates. So I request all delegates watching this to please share their questions in the Q&A tab of their screen, which will be brought up by the moderator after the panel discussion concludes. Delegates also have the option to answer a few poll questions related to this session at the Resource Center tab of the Keystone platform. So, moving on to the panel discussion, the esteemed moderator for this discussion is Mr. Anirban Ghosh, Chief Sustainability Officer for Mahindra Group. Under his leadership, Mahindra has developed an award-winning sustainability framework and become the first to have a certified carbon-neutral factory in India. Along with the moderator, we in the panel today, we have many accomplished speakers representing both the India and the EU private sector. Please give a small wave if possible as I mention your names. Mr. Ram Vaidyanathan, Head of Environmental Sustainability for Godrej Industries Limited. Ms. Shloka Nath, Executive Director for the India Climate Collaborative and also Head of Sustainability Portfolio at Tata Trust. Next, we have Mr. Leonard Silvis, Global Director, Water for Industry, Royal Haskoning, Gateway. We have Mr. Frederick Waringer, Head of Climate and Infrastructures Department at AETS. Thank you for that. Mr. Hans-Peter Egler, Director for Public Sector and Sustainable Infrastructure at South Pole. This is our we look forward to a very insightful discussion with the panel. And Mr. Aniban, may I request you to please take the discussion forward and give your remarks.
Thank you, Adishri, for introducing all of us. The platform has been set. We know that 55% of us live in urban areas. Many of these urban areas must be along water bodies because a lot of urban people love looking at the sea or the Great Lakes, as the case may be. We've also learned that the sea level is rising. We've learned that there are 32% more cyclones in the last 5 years. 40% of Mumbai is expected to be underwater. We've heard that the Great Green Wall has to be built, sea walls have to be built, and so on. Clearly, it's a very large problem, and I'm sure the panelists today will tell us what actions we must take to not get submerged, no pun intended, by these large problems. So let me first call on Ram from the Godrej Group for his perspectives and to share with us at least one way in which we can adapt to this developing solution. Ram, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anirban. And in the interest of time, I'll just try to keep my comments very crisp. There doesn't exist a city today, coastal or not, that is not at risk from climate change. I think one of the biggest barriers to really scaling up action on climate has been the fact that the effects are not visible in the near horizon, which is something that I think both academia, us as industry have to really pushing the larger envelope of showing people the horizon is not really as far as we think it is. And particularly when it comes to Bombay, where our head office is, you must have read recently the news about the mangroves being felled for some large transmission projects. The issue is that climate resilience is not factored into infrastructure decision making to a large extent, and that's one of the biggest reasons why our cities are continuously at risk. From Godrej's perspective, at least, we are trying to work now more on the consumer side of things and trying to influence the consumption of our products and create products that will in some way mitigate or minimize the effect, both mainly in terms of packaging, which is one of the biggest issues in urban setting, as well as in terms of creating natural barriers to climate risks. So I think, there is a lot to be done, and it's not just coastal cities. I mean, I know the focus of this discussion is on that, but like I said, every large urban gathering that you can consider in India faces some form of climate risk or the other, be it intermittent cyclones, be it drought conditions, be it air pollution issues. What is really required from a macro perspective, like I said, is the consideration of climate resilience as part of infrastructure building. I think that is one I would like to start this discussion off by leaving that pin there.
Good thought, Ram. I know there's a lot of infrastructure in our budget this year, but I don't think I heard anything about climate resilience. So it's a good way to flag it off. Let me bring Shloka in. Shloka, your perspective, and if you can, one way in which we can build climate resilience. All yours.
Thanks, Anirban, and you've put it beautifully as usual. But going off of what Ram said, it's really interesting because contemporary Mumbai is quite literally a city that is born from the sea. But with rising sea levels and increased frequency and intensity of storms, the city's future does look very perilous indeed. And there's now an increasing awareness about how Mumbai does face tremendous ecological and social challenges through climate change, but much of the analysis addresses really isolated events rather than building a systemic lens through which to view the city's concentration of risk. And again, as Ram mentioned, we have several of India's largest corporate, financial, and industrial establishments which are headquartered in the city. So the city's future viability is not only consequential for its millions of residents, but also the Indian economy. So business leaders have incomplete information right now about our vulnerability to climate change, but yet at the same time, they could play a critical role in the conversation about adaptation and mitigation through working with planners, policymakers, and elected officials. I also want to say that there have been limited efforts right now to quantify these economic costs of past environmental disasters and the financial implications of future climate projections for, a coastal city like Mumbai is going to be really crucial. So the idea of resilience or preparedness for me really means erasing that blind spot to the best of our abilities. It really means predicting our risks rather than holding our breath until we can remedy in the wake of our disasters. And in order to build that resilience, we have to understand our vulnerabilities. So the impact of climate change, of course, are not going to draw rigid lines across sectors, yet we do. And this limits our capacity for response. And just to give you a quick example of a project, because you asked for that, we're currently working on something called a climate risk atlas. It really is aiming to cover critical vulnerabilities such as coasts, urban heat stress, water stress, etc., a number of different indicators to provide a base to understand, identify, and quantify hazards arising from specific climate risks across various sectors in a short time scale of about 5 to 10 years across different geographies across the country. And the idea is really to encapsulate a vulnerability indexing of Indian districts and to see how we might climate-proof our investments and activities going forward. So I'll pause there and hand it back to you.
Thank you, Shloka. I think that's good work, and I hope we use that work well to take action. Let me move on to Leonard. Leonard, your perspective, and if you can, one example of how to build resilience.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for this kind invite, and also for the interesting presentations we've seen so far. Well, I'm asked to add a perspective to the coastal resilience, and I've chosen to focus on supply chain risk and the impacts on local economies. So throughout the presentations, we've heard from the experts that how they see the future of coastal cities dealing with climate change, and we've seen this different perspectives. And I would like to add on the role of private sector in the meaning of the role of businesses, industries, or private infrastructure owners. So what I see is that multinational companies or many companies in general depend on production networks, supply chains, distribution channels that traverse the world. And due to the nature of these networks, local issues with supply and delivery of goods could lead to global disruption. So there's a strong interconnection, and these disruptive processes and practices, they can result in, well, a lot of things like unsafe working conditions, dissatisfied customers, loss of market share, income, production stops, etc., even loss of jobs locally. So the disruption of business may influence local economy as well. Well, and what I see is that that's reason for private sector, for industries to really make sure that their business is resilient to future change. So, and at the same time, of course, it's also a reason for the public sector to make sure the infrastructure, which is also used by the businesses, is resilient. So it's really an interconnected system. So, and we got experience, what might be interesting to share, maybe later on a little bit more, otherwise it take maybe too much time. We've developed resilient pathways, as we call it, for example, for the airport in Singapore, Changi Airport, because they realized, well, we got to look to the future and see what's happening with climate change. And we've made different scenarios to them. And very important with businesses, of course, and it's with the government maybe the same, but maybe with businesses even more, these pathways are also about investment. When do you invest what? When do you? What's the smartest way to invest in an adaptive way as to make sure that you're future-proofed? So we got examples of that. Maybe later on I'll elaborate a little bit more on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonard. These are early days in the resilience discussion. So building resilient pathways is a very important area of work, and I'm sure we'll have to do it for many, many more people. The Singapore airport is always known to be ahead of its time whenever it comes to new things. So I'm not surprised they asked you to do something for them. Let me move on to Frederick. Frederick, your perspective and an example of how we can become resilient going forward.
Thanks a lot. Just to introduce ourselves, at AETS, we are a multidisciplinary consultant. We are based in southwestern France, which is an area which is also badly hit by coastal erosion. And we are also based in Delhi under the auspices of our director, Mr. Sanjay Dhawan. And we work with the government of India and the European Union on a project which is called EU-India Urban Partnership. Now, the reason I'm here now is to talk about a project where we've teamed up with a small French company called Espace Pur, who was contacted by the government of Kerala in 2018 after the devastating monsoon rains that killed more than 500 people, because they were looking for alternative ways of building coastal resilience. When I say alternatives to the traditional, I would say, grey solutions, which are concrete structures or riprap, rock fill, which have, especially in Kerala, proven themselves to be inefficient because after some time they get washed away. Espace Pur, this French SME, has developed a process called Stabiplage, which is actually very simple. We heard about innovation before. Innovation is sometimes very simple. It's about geo-containers, actually geotextiles, which you fill with sand and which you lay along the beach, and which actually help the beach to resist and to actually recreate itself. There is going to be a demonstrator. So you're asking Mr. Ghosh for an example. It's actually, we want to experiment that specific technique in Kerala over the next year. It's now in the final stages of approval by the government of India. It's a demonstrator which will be financed by the French government, and we will monitor whether that alternative solution could indeed be the solution to the problems in Kerala.
That's a wonderful example, Frederick. In the work with nature, the insight that seems to work best is to help nature rejuvenate itself. And the example you shared fits very well with that kind of thinking. I also sense that you have many more examples, so I'm going to come back to you. Keep them ready. Moving now to Hans. Hans, your perspective and your example on how to enhance and build resilience.
Thank you very much, Ghosh. Thank you very much also for inviting us to be part of this illustrated panel. Actually, we have heard financing is depending also on the design. So it's crucial to include in any design of infrastructure project in coastal cities the consideration of resilience and at the design stage itself. It is recommended to adopt sector-specific, let's say, water, wastewater, solid water management, stormwater, building design, power, etc., resilience toolkits. Because if we want to do contribute at scale, we have to have toolkits available for the stakeholders being active in these fields. For example, in flood-prone areas, water treatment plant can fail due to inundation in water, failure of electricity due to floods, etc. Resilience in design would involve undertaking vulnerability as analysis, as we have heard, and the design for that vulnerability. For example, in above examples, possible solutions can be raise the water treatment plant above the specific water level, relocate the water treatment plant outside the flood-prone area, erect barriers to keep flood water from reaching components. In order to improvise the adoption of such toolkits in design, however, it is really recommended that this should become part of the regulation. Otherwise, it cannot be implemented. It will be only on a voluntary basis. For national and state transfer to cities should be linked to such adaptation. So coherence on all the measurements at all levels, from city, national to state, has to be introduced. The 15th Finance Commission has recommended to increase the share of central taxes for cities, but has not mandated made these mandatory transfers already. And this is really an issue which has to be introduced. Again, everything has to become mandatory and throughout the legal construction coherent. The financing of such climate resilient infrastructure has to be a mix of central government funding and operation and management costs through user charges. User charges should be at least to cover these operations and maintenance and the administrative costs. Central government devolution can be used for repayment of capital and interest costs. So how to levy user charges that are sufficient? It can be linking to propensity to pay. Therefore, two options we would like to consider: link user charge to property tax, and property tax should be linked to market value of the property. So two changes to be made. Another option should be the link property tax and user charges to the income through the linking of Aadhaar with PAN card, for instance. So just leave it there for the moment.
Hans, you almost preempted the next question, which was going to come to you given your specialization in finance. I gather you are talking about state funding, and you're talking about funding through operations and maintenance.
Yes.
Is that, so suppose we were to fund it that way, what role would the private sector have in building in resilience related projects? Or would the private sector be out of it totally? Questions for you.
Thank you very much. No, obviously, private sector has to be a key part. And I think this notion, which also has been mentioned, that this is a public-private partnership at all. I think operations, maintenance, and the administrations of these infrastructure projects, these should be a clear role of the private sector, of the operational private sector. And this part could be in the PPP model also financed by the private sector partners, whereas construction costs could be taken over by the public funding via the state or the national budget. And so this could then be established as a public-private partnership. And in addition to that, the concession fees and all the tariffs should be fixed also by the state. So there is an important role by the state, but for the operation and put in practice, there we need the private sector. Also because the managerial capacities, the innovation capacity, and obviously also because of the liquidity at hand they have from the financial sector. So I think that this resilience part is a very good example of a fair share of public-private partnership.
Okay, thank you for that. You have all done very well in time. So we can have lots more conversations if you continue to be as crisp in your answers. I've glanced through the questions. There are three broad things that are coming up. One is an anxiety on how to get private sector involved. Hans, you addressed a little bit of it. Maybe some of you will have ideas as well. Another area in which questions are coming is, are there any examples of disaster resilience that have been put in place? And a third one is, are there development plans that are in place for various locations, for urban locations, or whatever development plans are in place? Do they have resilience built into the plans? So these are the three broad areas in which questions are coming. Before I ask you to respond, I must mention a new learning that COVID has thrown up. And I'm wondering whether that should be a part of our conversation as well. The main reason why we survived COVID is because we had Wi-Fi, we had food, and we had electricity. And of course, we had access to healthcare. If we didn't have any one of these four, I don't know if we would have survived this last year. So should these four, or the continued existence of these four without disruption, be an important part of building resilience? If yes, then how? All right, so let me go to Frederick. Frederick,
yes, thank you.
Short at this.
Well, in terms of the involvement of the private sector, what I briefly described about what we are about, the demonstrator we are about to organize in Totapalli, so that's in the Alipe, or as it's called now, Alappuzha district in Kerala, is a typical example of how people can team up together. The original expectation, the original request came from the government of Kerala. And of course, if that demonstrator succeeds, they will be able to scale it up with their own funding. But the demonstration, the testing itself for this demonstrator is going to be financed by the French government. And we, as the private sector, we bring our innovation capacity and our project management capacity, and we will also, of course, have a local construction company that will be involved in building those geo containers. So it's not either or; it's really a cooperation between regional governments, who are the prime beneficiaries, the central government of India that has to approve, especially Niti Aayog. They all have all the different ministries, and we're waiting for the final approval of one ministry. They have to approve and own that initiative so that it can be replicated later. And then it will be on us to be as convincing as the private sector, as convincing as possible, to show that this technique can actually be replicated.
Okay, thank you for that, Leonard. Let me jump to Ram. And I'm coming to you, Ram, because you come from a private sector organization, and you have this fantastic project, which we believe is great for resilience for urban environments, your mangrove project. I don't know whether you started the mangrove project as an afforestation project, or because you didn't want natural resources to be destroyed, or because you were prescient and said, oh, this is about resilience. Tell us a little bit more, and tell us, is there anything else that the private sector can do?
Sure. The mangrove project actually was built with the dual idea. It wasn't about carbon sequestration at all to start off with. The original idea was to preserve green space and also to act as a natural barrier to floods in this coastal Bombay area. The idea, in fact, it's only in the last few years that we are looking to actively sequester carbon in many of the degraded parts of the mangroves. Now, the biggest issue here has been, in terms of unplanned expansion and encroachment into some of these mangrove areas, which then becomes very difficult to reverse. It's as much a political issue as it is a technical or a commercial issue. I think, but this is where I think the question about how can corporates be more engaged, I think they are engaged. The question is that in what are direct ways of engagement or direct ways of getting their funding, or what are the indirect methods of funding. I am going to take a slightly different stance here, in the sense that I think funding exists and it's available. The question is the link between the funds available and the technical know-how to execute it and create a city level or even a ward level plan is what is actually lacking right now. I think that is where the real gap is there. There's been plenty of funds, the mangroves themselves, I would say, there's been plenty of funds poured into the upkeep and the maintenance of the mangroves. But the issue isn't, that's more of, it's solving shorter term issues. There's no such creation of a long-term strategy for resilience, which does not depend only upon private sector intervention or only upon the government's intervention. I think Frederick also mentioned the public-private partnership works really well in India. And I think climate resilience also has to be approached in the same way as a PPP, and not only looking at the private sector or only looking at government to make regulations. So I think it's very critical to involve all the stakeholders, including the residents or the inhabitants, because they're equally at stake in this particular issue. So I think the mangroves can even be expanded further, and I think it can be replicated to other cities as well. On even the concept of using natural barriers, it doesn't necessarily have to be coastal cities, like I said earlier. The concept of natural barriers as for climate resilience can really be built upon, because we really do have the funds. We just need the technical know-how and the right guidance to create a large-scale plan.
Okay, Ram. So, Shloka, your turn. There are 3 things. You can pick up whichever one you want to talk about or more. How do we get private sector involved? Examples of disaster resilience, and if you are aware of any plans for any urban area which has resilience built into it. One or more, your choice.
Or all 3. I thought you might offer me all 3, Anirban.
Go for it.
Actually, thank you. No, it's a great set of questions, and I think I will actually attempt to answer all 3. But just going off of what Ram said and building off the private sector piece initially, I think the one thing to point out is that the private sector has historically always actively supported disaster relief and rehabilitation. So while this trend continues, I think what we're seeing now is that there is a shift in how relief and rehabilitation is being approached. So rather than simply donating money, we're finding corporations are developing more strategic approaches that are really drawing on their considerable expertise, things like information management or technology, procurement, setting up distribution networks, etc., to sort of enhance the effectiveness and efficacy of post-disaster relief and rehabilitation. A couple of really quick examples for you. The Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, used its expertise to support the revival of micro, small, and medium enterprises which were hit by the Chennai floods in 2015. IBM is currently working with the Tamil Nadu government on cloud-based technology to enhance early warning systems as well as emergency response. The organization I work for, the Tata Sustainability Group, has created a cadre of really response managers drawn across the companies to lead response and relief operations. So corporate India is very, very involved. Breaking that down further into 3 quick categories, I would say number 1 is information technology providers. We're seeing a growing number of these who are building solutions to deliver technical information on climate and weather patterns to help governments, communities, and households take really appropriate decisions to reduce disaster risks or impacts. The second is startups. We haven't discussed that community, but a number of them are, again, working on technology solutions to tackle challenges posed by climate change. A good example is SkyMet Weather Services. They monitor and predict weather patterns and provide advisory services to address risks to agriculture. And of course, the third category is social enterprises. These are businesses, of course, with a social purpose. Again, many, many examples of these that we can go into that really provide both revenue generating services, but are looking to bring in or advance sustainable livelihoods in the face of disasters and climate change. So we're seeing a lot from the private sector, just to sort of bring that out. I think the one thing that I do want to say is, that India over the next few years is going to invest billions of dollars in public infrastructure. We're looking at 100 new airports with an investment of $60 billion. We're looking at interlinking our rivers at a budget of 5.5 lakh crores. We're creating a network of linked ports through Sagarmala, where there's an outlay of 4 lakh crores for that. We're looking at a 29-kilometer coastal road project in Mumbai itself. It's going to cost 10,000 crores. All of these initiatives are going to impact the lives and livelihoods of millions and will compete for finite and very scarce public resources. But if you asked me if any of them are really being screened against their impacts on climate change, tragically, the answer is often no. And this is the case despite India being considered the 5th most vulnerable of 181 countries to the effects of climate change. So we know that both small and large-scale natural hazards will inflict irreparable harm on the most poor and marginalized communities. And this is the final lens that I wanted to bring out, is that climate change will result in poverty, increase sort of the poverty and marginalized and vulnerable communities in this country. It's going to have very adverse impacts on them. They're going to reduce the development gains we've made thus far rather than reversing those. And really, we need to start from the first mile where the impact is felt the most. We do need approaches that enhance community resilience against the health, livelihood, as well as other shocks that are going to arise from climate change related disasters. So I would really advocate for targeting the most vulnerable as well.
Cannot disagree with you. And your concern comes through very clearly through your comments. Lennart, your thoughts on the subject? Lennart, can you hear us? And is your microphone working?
Yep, it's working, but I double-clicked instead of once, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I started talking. The good thing, what I see when I'm reaching out to a lot of multinational companies and industries is that most of them, they do realize that climate risk really affects their bottom line. If not now, it will in the future. So I think that's a good starting point. It's about awareness. So they must choose how rather than, if they improve their resilience. And I see things changing there, and not only from the flood resilience part we've been talking a lot about, but also from the drought risk they face. And some of them, there's maybe more companies that face drought risk than flood risk. And they do take action, actually. That's what I experience. If you take a look in India, we're also currently involved in a resilience study of six urban areas in India along the coast. For example, I think it was Goa, Kerala, Gujarat. So Kerala was mentioned already. And this is really where we're guiding decision makers to improve the city's resilience and reduce the risk to, let's say, hydrometeorological hazards. Another interesting example of a true public-private partnership concerns an example of coastal erosion that was communities were facing this coastal erosion, and at the same time a gas terminal was facing the same coastal erosion. And this really has led to a very interesting public-private partnership, a true one, also from the investment side, where we have used building with nature principles. So using the forces of nature and the sand being replaced by the strong forces of the sea to strengthen the coast again. So that's a very interesting example, I'd say, where public and private sector really came together to strengthen the coast in this case. So from that perspective, I'm rather positive. I think a challenge is if, for example, I think many of the coastal cities we're talking about, also in India, they'll have ports, harbors. And in these ports, there'll be a lot of industries. And they will face sea level rise. They will face even thunderstorms coming in, and they need proper drainage. But sea level rise may be the most challenging one. And that would be good. And we have one example on that the port itself, which a lot of time is maybe publicly owned, takes the initiative to draw climate scenarios for the next 20, 50, and maybe even 100 years. And by showing what impact from also a financial perspective such sea level rise has, they started talking with the private sector industries that are located in this port area. And this has really led to investments of the government, of course, for the infrastructure, some of the infrastructure, but also on their own sides, they took measures to make sure that they're ready for the next 10 or 20 years. They didn't want to look for 100 years. So there's good examples where public and private really kind of assist each other in raising awareness and working towards investments to become more resilient.
As I listen to all of you making your points, and I reflect on the fact that a lot of action will be required to ensure that the investments being made in infrastructure are not put at risk. The question that comes to mind is, will this then lead to the creation of many new industries or the rapid growth of some existing industries? So why don't I ask you to share thoughts on which industries are likely to grow and where are jobs likely to get created in the effort to build resilience around the world, in coastal areas and otherwise. In fact, it occurs to me that actions on building resilience or adaptation are completely GDP accretive. Unlike mitigation actions, where, let's say, work on renewable energy will probably have a negative effect on thermal power plants. So whatever mitigation action one takes on, there is a plus and there is a minus. But in adaptation actions, there is no minus if the adaptation is done well. So let me throw the question to you. Which industries do you think will grow? What technologies do you think will kind of prosper and develop and so on? So let me go to Hans first, since he's been quiet for a very long time. But I'll come to each of you. There is plenty of time, so do keep a thought ready. Hans, all yours.
Thank you very much. So being quiet is not really my piece of cake. No worries. Now I have the space. No, just kidding. No, actually, I think taking or building resilience into our whole, let's say, way of life will really boost innovation a lot. And in addition to that, this innovation is not limited to any sector. The innovation is focusing on designs, is focusing on construction materials. Everything is forced to change what cannot offer sustainable solutions. So this sustainability and resilience go hand in hand. And the pandemic experience right now even more focuses on innovation. So I see a lot of innovation in new companies, in new areas popping up. I would not limit this because innovation is just characterized by endless way to go. So I think let's take it that way. It is with innovation, additionality, creativity, and breaking up of walls, because now new, let's say, associations will happen, not only public-private, but also impact-private, NGOs, civil societies, all will have their role, because what we have understood in the last years is that our challenges to solve the planet in the future and our own lives depend on the collaboration of all potential partners together. And I think there we have a huge a field of operations. And if we just also focus on the financial sector, also the financial sector will innovate a lot. The insurance companies will innovate a lot. Assurance will become different because you assess risks differently than before. And so everything starts to we are, for instance, also as Southpol working in a program funded by the Swiss government, which is called Capacities, active in 8 cities, where we see already a real change of attitude also from the cities level, the cities administration, to incorporate resilience and climate change activities right in the beginning of their priority setting and in their allocation of budgets for infrastructure sector. So in my interpretation, there are all the innovation sectors or the sectors which can also, old-fashioned sectors which have capacity to innovate, have now a great opportunity to become market partners and active partners, be it at local, national, or international level.
Very well. Thank you, Hans. I'm going at random, so may I go to Frederick now?
Yes, thanks. To be very down to earth, the adaptation specialists call that co-benefits. When actually adaptation efforts can benefit different populations and different ecosystems. Going back to the technique that we're going to experiment in Totapilli in Kerala. In India that it's a very touristic area. We've got an example which was implemented by our partner Espace Pur in French Guyana in Southern America a few years ago, where this natural sedimentary dynamics, which allows the as you said, Mr. Ghosh, which allows the beach to rejuvenate itself, also allowed for to create a spawning area for sea tortoises. So it can also benefit fauna and flora, and therefore benefit local tourism and allow local authorities to market a green tourism. So that's a typical example where we can actually save the coast, but also foster the local economy.
Great. Thanks a ton. I had a small googly thrown at me, which I've managed to negotiate. We still have a few minutes. Quick comments, Shloka, and then Ram.
I was going to go back to the MSME sector. That was sort of where I feel there's a real opportunity to sort of build some real, resilience or investment towards resilience. I think there are a number of issues, of course, that the MSME sector is facing. And I think your point earlier about sort of resurrecting the issues around COVID is a really, really crucial and important one. So I'm going to keep my remarks short, but I do think that there's an opportunity to really drive tremendous amount of financing towards the MSME sector to prepare them for the challenges of climate change that are, of course, facing them, and to build more resilience within that sector. So that's an avenue or an opportunity area that I think both the private sector as well as when it comes to government funding as well as the philanthropic sector can all step in to resurrect and build more resilience around.
Right, thanks, Shloka. Ram, and I think I didn't go to Lennart in this round, did I? So if I didn't, Lennart, you'll come in after Ram. Go on, Ram.
Thank you. So in the interest of time, very quickly, I think technology and technology providers, startups, I know, not everything can be solved by a startup or an app, but there is a lot of potential, like what Shloka mentioned, from the MSMEs, not just from the MSMEs, but also from small innovators, small grassroots innovators who have a lot of models that they can share from their local experience, which can be scaled up. And I think I alluded to the fact earlier, the issue is more about how do we get financing to scale up some of these solutions. If you just go to any startup competition or hackathon, you will see plenty of climate resilient solutions being built even at the farm level. But the question is, how do we then scale this up and get industries to adopt this and even cities to adopt it at a larger level? So I would go in the startups as an area where we should focus on building new jobs.
Very good. Good thought. Lennart.
Yes, thanks. 2 points, very brief. One is insurance, mentioned already, and the second one is digital. Insurance, because I think it's really needed to create financial incentives to make sure that industries, private sector, is accelerating its investments in resilience, and insurance can play a very important role in that because, of course, they transfer risks from an insured organizations to themselves. That's one thing. And the second thing is digital sector. I'd say that digital solutions or innovations also can play an important role in forecasting not only long-term scenarios but also nowcasting to make sure that you minimize damage potentially created by weather-related events. So I'd see those two changes, the one on insurance, the financial aspects, and the two on digital, that are really important to watch and also to put your money on if you want to make sure that we going to live in a more resilient world.
Thanks a ton. It would be futile to try and say everything that you've said over the last 40-45 minutes, but let me see what the big things are that stayed with me. I think it was very clear from the initial presentations in our conversation that resilience is necessary, that there is enough threatening resilience already. Given that we are just about getting started, planning must be done, climate risks must be assessed, and pathways for resilience must be created, all of which you've mentioned in the course of the conversation. In fact, sometimes I wonder whether we should go back and learn from the Dutch and about the walls they built many hundreds of years ago and how they managed to keep their country safe. And perhaps the Dutch will be an answer to a lot of our problems in coastal areas around the world. We discussed the necessity for resilience in design. I'm happy to give a shout out for that, Leonard. So we discussed resilience in design, and we mentioned at the same time the amount of infrastructure that's being created without building resilience into it. So clearly we've got to figure out a way of making that happen, especially because resilience, adaptation don't feature in the development plans of most cities or most areas as of now. I know we've mentioned the Mumbai First conference, which was held earlier. And I remember a very big discussion there on the fact that in the new development plan, there was very little mention of climate adaptation. In recent times, I happened to have a similar conversation in the city of Calcutta with the Bengal Chamber of Commerce. And I found the same was the case with development plans of that city as well. So I won't be surprised if that is more the reality and less the exception. We've, in recent times, been having a lot of learning on how we need to be resilient or what we need to do to be resilient. There was the unprecedented tsunami some years ago. There is COVID now. In fact, just yesterday or day before, there was this new thing called a glacier burst that happened in northern India. And we're trying to figure out how to deal with this and wondering whether this is the first of many future occasions and what does one have to do to minimize damage were it to happen again. So clearly we must leverage the experience we're having in trying to recover from various kinds of disasters that are happening at greater frequency around the world, and not just look at band-aid solutions which get us going once again. One of the important things all of you have mentioned is the need for information so that we can take action on the basis of the information that we get. We learn more about how these disasters are happening, what is happening as a result of the disasters, and hopefully take necessary action so that we can A, reduce the number of disasters, and B, reduce the damage caused by these disasters. Which of course brings me to a point which we heard towards the end, that we must build all of this into the insurance business. We must build all of this into the construction business. And just as a parting thought, I'm wondering whether this will lead to the creation of amphibious vehicles once again, which were last built, I think, during the Second World War. I did take a tour called the Duck Tour on one such vehicle. But given everything that we've described, it seems logical that the automobile companies should start building amphibious vehicles once again. And of course, the great possibility that Elon Musk's Boring Company will soon have a lot of competition, Because if we want to stay safe as these disasters are happening, we'll have to do a lot of digging. And Boston's big dig might then get replicated around the world in many other urban areas. But then those are just initial thoughts. I'm sure we will all get opportunities to build on these conversations as we go forward. But I'm just glad that the conversations on resilience and adaptation are now happening in right earnest, because I think all of us know that in conferences, even a year or two ago, we barely had a session on adaptation and resilience. So thank you very much for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for your contributions. I know Terry does a wonderful job of documentation, so this will at least be available to build on going forward in other conversations on resilience and an adaptation. And I hope this does go into the various plans for urban areas, the various development plans and the various actions that we are taking. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh, for the enlightening panel discussion and also for posing such relevant questions. And we also thank our delegates for posing relevant questions to the panelists, as well as shedding light on the significant role of the private sector that it plays right now in achieving climate resilience. And we thank our panelists for an interactive discussion and for their very contextualized insights and inputs. It has been very useful for all of us to understand your take on the situation and the circumstances that we live in right now. May I invite Mr. Edwin to please provide a few concluding remarks?
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, I think Mr. Anirban Ghosh did an excellent job in summarizing what was said during the panel discussion. And one of the phrases that struck me was that for the private sector, it's not the question if they need to deal with climate risks, but how. So how to deal with climate risk. And this is even more relevant, I think, in coastal cities where this should really be a question. And I fully agree with Mr. Ghosh that the need for planning is essential. But I would like to mention one thing that we are doing in the European Union with our investments in infrastructure. Because I think that Mr. Ghosh was really right with referring to the power sector, the digital sector, and also the need to have food and probably also the transport to get the food in the cities. Those are essential for being resilient, not only during a pandemic, but also during a flood. You need all these things to stay operational. So in the European Commission, we are climate proofing our investments, which means that we are looking at the resilience, climate resilience of the infrastructure we are investing in, and also actually at the carbon footprint of that infrastructure, which also is referring to the nature-based solutions. We prefer solutions that also have a good carbon footprint. I also think it is indeed very important to have the conclusions and the recommendations in writing, and indeed Terry will probably do so, and we are happy to help. And I'm very keen on a follow up in the context of the global governance of mayors, in the context of our partnership on smart and sustainable urbanization. In the context of the Adaptation Future Conference, I think we need to continue this discussion, and I think we really had the right people in our panel and in our session today. So thank you very much, and back to you, Mrs. Adishe.
Thank you so much, Edwin, for beautifully wrapping up the session for me as well. And with this, we conclude with the thematic track today. We thank you all for your active participation. We are grateful that you have been present during our session. We are grateful to all the speakers and panelists to help taking the conversation further about how to integrate the private sector in climate resilience, and also how to understand the relationship between public and private sector to achieve resilience in at least India, if not, if we can't control the situation anywhere else. As I mentioned earlier, the delegates can answer a few poll questions related to this session at the resource center of the Keystone platform. I also request everybody to please proceed to other thematic tracks at the other venues, and I extend an invitation to everybody to attend the inaugural session by the Honorable Prime Minister at 6:30 p.m. at Pavagada venue. This is in Indian time. We thank all our partners, European Union and GIZ, to make the session possible, as well as the WSTS, TERI and Keystone teams for providing constant support. It has been my pleasure and privilege to be among such a diverse audience of practitioners and experts who are constantly working towards improving the fabric of the cities that we live in. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you, Adishri.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.